G'day, it's nice to be here in a room full of restoration ecologists, so pleased to be here. My presentation today, I want to focus on wetland forest restoration, and in particular how we can do this at really large, or our thoughts about how we might do this at really large scale, and really cost effectively, so we can make the most out of this billion tree planting opportunity. Bruce and Kitty and others have talked a little bit about this, but once upon a time we had lowland forests across much of lowland New Zealand, and in wetter areas they would have been dominated by Pukatea, Kakatea, Mairi. They were phenomenally diverse and rich and productive. They were important mahinga kai gathering places for Maori, huge flocks of kiridu and kaka, and if we could get some of them back, it would be a big, big step forward for biodiversity in New Zealand. You know the story. We were pretty successful at knocking them all down. Took quite a lot of hard labour, but we got there in the end. And we also drained many of the places that these forests were based on, and so the hydrology's changed quite a bit now, and so getting them back to a state that they were once in will be quite tricky. And so various folks have looked at the extent of loss, and Johnson and Gabot estimate that there's only 6% of this wetland forest type left, and most of that's constrained to southwestland. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs. And the damage is ongoing, so there's a legacy effect of the drainage that was put in place around much of the country in lowland areas to keep farmlands farmable. There's ongoing loss through chopping down trees, and ongoing drainage works that are happening as we speak. There are also a bunch of pernicious weeds that have taken hold. This is a grey willow population on the Reo arm of Whangamarino. Grey willow and Whangamarino dominate about 900 hectares of that wetlands, and they're also very dominant in wetlands across the country, and they produce pretty dense sort of canopy, which inhibits the growth of many of the native tree species. So how do we get from this very parlous, degraded state to something that we'd be happier with? Well, this is something that we've been thinking about a little bit over the last wee while, as many of you will have been as well. And just to focus particularly on grey willow dominated wetlands, we set up a research project at 3 sites across the country. A site in Whangamarino, one in Tongariro Delta at the southern end of Taupo, and one at Harts Creek off the edge of Lake Ellesmere in Canterbury. And at each of these sites we tested 2 herbicides. One that was relatively untested, Garlon 360, it's a Triclipper amine, and we were pretty keen on that herbicide because it's dicot selective and it's relatively benign ecologically. But it turned out to be a terrible waste of time. It did a very poor job at killing the willow, and it did a spectacular job of killing the native shrubs, and so we've backed right away from recommending the use of Triclipper. But glyphosate did produce some fairly compelling results, so we applied that to a number of swaths through each of these 3 wetlands, and measured the response at a series of plots. So to begin with, we have a panel sort of representing a plot in the Whangamarino wetland. You can see a bit of royal fern in the foreground and grey willow in the back. 1 year after glyphosate application, it looked pretty grave, and we were a little bit scared about what we'd done. 3 years after treatment, a massive flush of native plants. Mostly small-leafed coprosmas, Tenuicornis, propinqua, a lot of sedges and rushes, and so we're pretty pleased with that. But we noted at that stage that there was a huge amount of reinvasion of grey willow, and 5 years after we did that experiment, it is now almost developing back to a willow canopy. So we have willows about at 1 inch DBH, and I would expect that that site will be back to where it started at in another 15, 20 years. So obviously we've got to do something in addition to just applying herbicide. We can't rely on that alone. And the likely thing seems to be to reintroduce some of those canopy dominants that grow taller than grey willow and could provide sufficient shade to displace grey willow over time. And so we were particularly interested in Carcatea. It grows fast. It was once dominant in these swamplands on the edge of these large wetlands. And so we set up an experiment just at Harts Creek, looking at the response of Carcatea to these different treatments. So we planted Carcatea in plots in the Triclipper treatment, in the glyphosate treatment, and in a non-treatment, and looked at growth over a year and a half period. And what we found was that, as others have found before us, is that Carcatea really like light. And if they're growing in an area that's well lit, they can grow phenomenally quickly. We were measuring on average sort of somewhere above 50, well up towards 50 centimetres per annum. So they're in the right conditions, they can grow very, very rapidly. But where there is dense shade under the willow canopy, they grew very, very slowly, and in many cases we got negative growth. So the apical stem of the planted Carcatea died back and they shrunk in size. So the message is Carcatea need light, and planting them underneath a existing canopy is unlikely to lead to a reasonable success. So having sort of got to the stage where we figured that we could grow Carcatea if we manipulated willow canopies or Manuka canopies, we started looking around at sites on public conservation land that had the characteristics of swamp forest, and we found ourselves armed with about 30,000 hectares, which is not a small amount of land. And so we started at the same time thinking about how we might do this type of planting at really, really large scale. Then along came these characters, talking about planting 1 billion trees, talking about improving freshwater quality and storing carbon, and saw this as a great opportunity to really launch into some of this stuff at scale. And then we started to contemplate how we might go about doing it. And we sort of first of all thought about existing planting methods. So going out into these wetlands and planting small seedlings or saplings. And what we realised very, very quickly is this is going to be a very expensive exercise. At least $30,000 a hectare, probably a lot more given the difficulty walking around a wetlands treed with willows. The other characteristics of these two sort of approaches we looked at were planting a great big block, which we felt might be more resilient to re-invasion of willows because of the density of the plantings and the sort of the large size to edge area. But it would take a very long time for those trees to reach maturity and that seeds to be dispersed across the wetland. And so we also contemplated planting smaller sites across the wetland, giving us more extensive planting, but that faced the risk of sort of more being each of those coops being a little bit more vulnerable to re-invasion of willow because of the small perimeter to area planting. So then we started thinking about grand schemes. And what we know about Carcatea is that in mast years it produces very, very large numbers of seeds. Yesterday I went out and emptied a couple of seed drain traps I put out a month ago, and I've collected, I think, probably about 13 or 14 kilograms of seed in about an hour. So we can collect very, very big volumes of this stuff. It's a small round seed about the size of a 2 millimetre ball bearing, I guess. So it's actually ideally suited to be sown using agricultural equipment. The seed germinates readily from fallen seed under the trees, so we know that the germination rates can be pretty high, and we think it could be pretty easily spread by a helicopter. So we're quite interested to see whether we could establish Kākatea under willow populations by dispersing seed across those sites, and then subsequently come along and manipulate the canopy to increase light after germination has taken place. And so we're interested in measuring germination and survival of sown seed. We'll probably do it by hand to begin with as a proxy for aerial seeding. But and we'll measure competition, the effect of light, and the effect of mammalian browse, and we can manipulate all of these things with exclusion fences and opening of the canopy. So that's one branch of research that we're embarking on now. And the other one that we've become interested in is these large areas of grazing land that sit adjacent to many of these wetlands that are actually, it's DOC managed lands that we roll leases over on because we really don't know how to manage it. And if we were to take it back into the fold, so to speak, it would become a big management headache unless we can somehow change the state of this to a manageable one. And so we've been thinking about this kind of a situation, as has Tim, who will speak after me. And we've been thinking about applying agricultural methods to re-establishing forest on these types of land. So what we want to do is, I'll just go back one, is we want to spray and then cultivate some plots adjacent to, on this ex-grazing land, and use an agricultural drill to plant a number of species that would have been found in these types of places at pretty high density. Maybe 20 centimetre spacings between rows. And again, we want to test the effects of competition with weeds, which we can manipulate with herbicides, the effect of mammalian browse, soil moisture and fertility. And there are 4 species that we've chosen because they are pretty robust. 3 of them we can predict when they're going to seed at very large abundances, about 1.5 years to 2 years in advance. Flax, cabbage trees and Kākatea. They're all pretty robust and they grow pretty quickly. And and we can collect large volumes of seed for each of these different species, so it makes it pretty easy for us. And so that's another arm of this research program. And we want to test these sort of novel approaches against conventional approaches to look at the sort of cost-efficacy balance between these different ways of establishing forest. And in summary, I don't need to say that, but thank you very much.